We are live.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another session. This is the 59th session of Startup Buzz, which I think by now most of you know. We do every Thursday, 5 p.m. This week we have a very, very interesting topic. And, to bring it alive, we have Jigyasa who's going to moderate this, and our guest is Akash. Before I hand it over to them, I want to tell you that besides having a continuous stream of startup bus sessions. The CII Western region has also embarking on a mentorship program for startups. A lot of about that has been in the social media for the past few weeks. So if you haven't already, written in, please do so now, and you can see it on LinkedIn, on X, and so on. Uh, Over to you, Jigyasa and Akash, and have a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Welcome,
Thank you.
everyone, to a very interesting episode of CII Western Region Startup Buzz. Hi, I'm Jigyasa Kishore. I'm Senior Vice President for Enterprise Business with Moglix. And also, I co chair the IWN for Western Region CII. And today we have a very interesting guest, Akash, with us, who is the brain behind Diagnosis. And before, of course, the name is super interesting in itself and quite loaded. But before we delve deeper into what Diagnosis stands for or what it does, I would request Akash to introduce himself, and then we can take it from there.
Thanks, Jigyasa, and thanks for CII for having me. So I'm Akash, the co-founder and CEO of Diagnosis. And a short background about me: I grew up in Belgaum in Karnataka. I happen to grow up in a family of doctors. So currently, the 11 members of the Kulgod family who practice medicine, which was enough doctors. I realized I should go do something else since all the departments were already covered, and was lucky enough for my undergraduate to go to UC Berkeley in California, which is a great research university that allowed me to do a lot of different basic science courses where I dabbled in multiple different disciplines, but ended up choosing cognitive science as my major, which is a fusion of AI and neuroscience. And it's been 5 years since working on the idea of Diagnosis, initially as a research project and now as a full-fledged company, where we're based in Bangalore. We're about 50 humans and 15 dogs on the team working to a world where cancer can be detected early.
No, this is really, really amazing story. I was, in fact, trying to research a bit more about Diagnosis before coming to this webinar. And I read some really incredible stuff on your website and the news release and all of that, and the interesting research happening all over the world. And kind of now I understand the inspiration behind. I understand you come from a family of doctors, and definitely this would have intrigued you always. And then a combination of the cognitive AI that you've done plus this. But the question that really intrigues is that what was the moment when you decided that a dog's nose was a viable medical instrument and not just an anecdote? What was the moment for you when you decided that?
Yeah, and I'll add that we're also a family of dog lovers. So at one point there were 11 dogs and 11 doctors in the Kulgod family. So that love for dogs is also something that comes in the blood and is something that since childhood has been present. The start for Diagnosis was really, it was during the COVID pandemic, and that was the first time I learned that dogs could sniff out diseases. They were being deployed in 60 countries around the world to sniff out COVID from just people standing in a checkpoint or someone's breath or sweat. And even in India, the Indian Army trained two dogs to detect COVID-19 at a base camp. So this was something that everyone was doing, and there was a lot of press and a lot of noise about it. And I learned about it then. But what I also realized digging into it was that, this was all cool papers and research and, as you said, anecdotes, but it didn't seem to actually move from something that existed and that we knew worked. In some of the studies, it was better than RT-PCR, which was the gold standard for diagnostics, at least rapid diagnostics for COVID. The dogs were actually better than the yardstick used to measure them. but it remained something that was research. It didn't really have a real world impact. And I could see this upfront. At the time, my father was directing a COVID hospital in Belgaum, and the second wave in India during the summer of 2021 was quite bad. And, the fact that we had dogs in so many homes and on our streets didn't really change anything, despite us knowing that this ability existed. So the question to me 5 years ago was, why is that the case? What's stopping the dogs from actually sniffing out diseases at scale? And to answer that question, that basically launched this whole project and initiative.
That sounds very interesting. So, and is there any special kind of breed which you think is doing better than the others in this in your research, or you still do sort of zero down on that?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to the question. We have 15 dogs, 11 of them are beagles. Beagles are great for this type of work because this
Medical
type of
sciences
work,
usually, beagles have been used extensively, right?
yeah, most of the work in the medical and pharma world with dogs has been experiments on the dogs, and we don't do experiments on the dogs. We do essentially the dogs are doing experiments on us, right? They're the ones actually telling us things, and we use purely reinforcement learning. It's more similar to airport and police dogs in terms of the detection training. And there are beagles used in that work as well, because they really like to sniff. You can say they have a passion for sniffing, and they really like to eat, and those are the two things you need actually to enjoy sniffing a lot, right? Which is what the work really is about. But in terms of
Mhm.
their noses, the hardware and software of a dog's nose, it might vary across breeds, but we haven't really figured out what that variation means for performance. There's a quite an infamous study where in Texas University, by the Canine Olfaction Lab, they actually compared German Shepherds to pugs in their ability to detect various compounds. And,
Mhm.
like I'm sure most people here know what a pug looks like. They barely have a nose. And German Shepherds are used in airports and, by police, and they're a classic
Right.
like a police dog. And in this
Mhm.
experiment, the five pugs actually performed better than the six German shepherds, right?
Really?
And yeah, and that's crazy. Like we have no idea why
Yeah.
that would be the case. And I think it just goes to show we don't really understand canine olfaction and how the dogs do what they do. So when we don't understand something, making comparisons between different dog breeds is a bit more challenging because we just don't know actually what we're comparing.
Before we delve deeper into the dog questions, because of course this is all very intriguing, and I have a bunch of questions for you. I want to know a little bit more about your co-founder because his background is also very intriguing, a researcher and a former special ops person. How did you guys really come together? How does this combination work?
Yeah, so Itamar, my co-founder, he grew up in Israel, and in Israel you have to serve in the military. He ended up serving in the K9 unit, where they do bomb detection and other kinds of special operations with dogs. And
Mm,
the unit really, other units rely on this unit for life and death stake situations. So whether it's safe to go, that there's no explosive or bomb, they're trusting their lives on the dog's nose, and this is really at the highest, most stressful level possible. And after he finished his service, he worked in another Israeli startup doing something similar. They were training dogs to detect breast cancer and Parkinson's. And he worked there for 2 years and saw that indeed dogs can detect diseases. He saw it with his own eyes. And we ended up connecting when I was a visiting researcher in Israel in 2023 before the war, when it was totally okay to go to Israel. And I was working in a lab doing machine vision for animal behavior decoding. And I'd gone there to also just talk to people in the startup and the neurotech ecosystem because Israel has quite an
right.
incredible system. And I ended up connecting with Ithamar, and we both realized that we were obsessed about the same thing and we're approaching it from two different complementary lenses. So we realized we should work together. It was obvious. And we realized we should start in India because it was actually the best place to do this. So he relocated to India. We're in the same office. We live in the same apartment right now, and we've been
Mhm.
building for the last 2.5 years together.
Which is again, I think you just led me to my the next question that I was about to ask you. You said India would be the right place to do this. I mean, why India and why Bangalore in particular?
Yeah, I think, India has a real competitive advantage when it comes to building products that require clinical validation. And
Hmm.
especially today, the work of finding either novel diagnostics or novel drugs or therapies, that's become a lot easier. AI can accelerate a lot of the scientific discovery process. There's a lot of buzz about drug discovery. There's a company, CII Discovery, that just recently, had a huge deal with Eli Lilly and raised $400 million to use AI to find novel therapeutic compounds.
Hmm.
But finding novel compounds or novel diagnostics doesn't make your product, right? You actually have to show it works in the real world with real human populations and do this in large trials that show that there's meaningful differences in what the system can do or the drug can do. And the diagnosis, we knew that we had to validate this at scale. We knew that it was not enough to show another study that was small and underpowered and people would question. We really needed to show that this worked and could scale to an entire population. And to do that, we needed a lot of clinical data. And India allowed us to get a lot of data and work with amazing clinicians and hospitals and institutes. And, we have a large population, we have a large disease burden. So you can actually run very high powered studies and have that clinical validation much faster and a fraction of the cost than it would take in the US. So, we did this 3,000 participant plus study that was published a few months ago. This would have easily cost us 10x the money and would have taken us at least 3x the time if we were in the US. And, in India, I think Bangalore still has the edge of just having a lot of density, people in terms of engineers and researchers, and just the general network is quite strong here. But I don't think diagnosis could have only been started in Bangalore. It could have worked in other places. I'm just from Karnataka and I had a network here and it felt like the right place to start.
Right. No, I think you're right. I mean, Bangalore also has a lot of startup ecosystem, which helps you with all the other peripheral things that you need for, startup. But no, interesting. But, also that brings me to a point that I still feel I'm a dog person. I have a dog, and I feel that always that India is still not as pet friendly as we would want it to be. So, how was the reaction of people who you were dealing with, and were they accepting of this experiment, or did you face a lot of challenge?
Yeah, I think actually that's not really been a challenge. I think a lot of people, especially in the last few months, as a lot of press pieces and social media attention came to us after the publication of our study, we get a lot of
Nice.
people really interested in what we do because we work with dogs. We've been doing long conversations with people who have reached out to us expressing interest in taking our test. And someone said this one line, which I thought was really memorable. They said, I don't trust humans or machines, I trust dogs. And
Ah.
I think there's a large proportion of people, obviously dog lovers, but also people who might be more neutral, who know that dogs have been detecting and sniffing things for us for a while, that the police and the military still depend on them at airports for life
Absolutely.
and death stake situations, and that this idea that we're trusting dogs with our health is something that is very natural to a lot of people. I think it also is more interesting and curious and exciting than most diagnostics. So it actually has inspired people to reach out to us, even though they might not have reached out if we were working on another modality. Because the dogs were in the picture, they were excited to learn more.
No, absolutely. And I think for a long time in some of the docuseries, etc., we've been seeing how dogs can detect seizures really early on. And, in some of the cases, those are like really wonderful real life documentaries that inspire us. But Akash, what is the science behind it? Like, if you could just explain it in the most simple terms, like you were explaining to a fifth standard kid. We have 200, 300 plus people watching this webinar. It would be really nice to understand what exactly is the science behind the dog sense BCI reading. I mean, what does it mean really, and how it
Yes.
works?
Yeah. So, I mean, the simple version is this: we, as humans, are we have a scent in our breath, right? And this scent comes from what is called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs for short. And these VOCs are a byproduct of our regular body's activity. We have cells in the body, they have metabolic processes. These metabolic processes have byproducts, and these byproducts, some of them are volatile, which means that they're basically light enough to escape out of the cell, enter into the bloodstream, and then end up in the breath. And so, breath actually has a very rich source of these VOCs. And these VOCs can essentially be perceived by even us, right? As humans, we can smell someone's breath. I mean, ideally, we hope to not smell someone's breath, but
Yeah.
if someone has bad breath, you can't smell it, right? And dogs with their noses have just way more sophisticated sense making abilities. They can smell in parts per trillion, they have more olfactory receptors, they have more of their brain devoted to smelling than we do. So the analogy I like to give is, if we are looking, um, comparing us to what the dogs can see, the dogs are seeing in 4K ultra high definition, and our machines and our noses are seeing maybe a few pixels, right? They're just seeing a much more vivid picture. So when they smell our breath, they're able to see things that we can't see with our machines or our own noses. And what they can see is basically the scent of cancer. So, cancer, because it is a biological aberration in cells, it's changing, it's basically cell division gone rampant, right? This is a very abnormal activity. It means that there's abnormal metabolic byproducts. And so, a dog is able to, when trained to recognize the scent, is able to pick it up, right? And that's what people have been doing for 20 years. You can train dogs to sniff out cancer and various other diseases by just purely positive reinforcement. And just there's a lot of nuance and a lot of know how needed to do it, but it can be done. What we're saying
Hmm.
then is the bottleneck has never been the dog's nose, it's been the humans being able to understand what the dog is smelling. Because they're another species, right? We don't have a language we can speak with them. So we're building the translator to the dog's mind. And that's where the
Mm.
BCI, which measures the dog's brain activity non invasively, basically the electrical activity that you can capture in humans as well, you can do with dogs. You can have cameras that record their behavioral data. You can have a sensor that measures their respiration activity. And you can get all of this data that can then inform a machine learning or an AI model to be able to tell you when the dog is actually recognizing cancer. And if you can build that translator, so you've solved the problem of how do you standardize and scale what the dogs do.
So at some point, I believe that right now, what is a brain signal would also translate into some sort of a behavioral signal for the dogs, or it's always the case.
Yeah, so I don't know if can the viewers, if I share a video, would they be able to see the video on my screen?
Anant, do you think so?
Yes, they will be.
That would be wonderful
Yes.
then.
So I'm just sharing a short video of what it looks like. And this is one of our dogs, Whiskey, who's wearing our helmet and our harness
Wow.
and is sniffing a face mask in each one of those ports. So all the greens were non-cancer, and the red was someone who had been diagnosed with cancer. And you'll see one of our dogs, Cheetah, do it again. And what's happening here is our dogs are basically rewarded with treats, right? Whenever they smell the red samples or the cancer samples. So they go back to the platform expecting a reward. And this expectation of reward is the behavioral response they're giving us, that they're smelling cancer.
Ah.
And this is a very
Mm.
natural association that they learn. Now,
Mm.
what we're also doing is, since we have the brain activity, which we're showing on the top of the screen, we have all these cameras and sensors. we can now quantify that behavioral response and be able to predict whenever the dog is sniffing cancer, what is the likelihood the dog is correct. So a trainer can tell you, okay, the dog is going back, and they can see all these small features, the hesitation in the sniff, how confident the dog is going back. And they can do a really good job of telling you whether the dog is actually smelling cancer or not. But our AI
Yeah.
trainers can go beyond what a human can do because they can read from the brain directly, right? And they can, they don't get tired like humans, and they can scale as they see more dogs across more days. And so the idea is the bottleneck to scaling has been the humans. Because if you saw the video, the dogs just take half a second to sniff a sample. Dogs are sniffing, 4 to 7 times per second. A dog can comfortably sniff 500 samples in less than 1 hour. So,
Mhm.
with very few dogs, with about 30 dogs, you can actually do 10 lakh samples in a year, with each dog sniffing less than 1 hour a day. So, they have a great work life balance compared to humans, where we are working for 8 hours and probably not able to be as productive as the dogs. So, we really think the bottleneck has actually been on the human side, and AI models can help us solve for that and let the dogs do what they do best, which is way better than what we have currently when it comes to early cancer detection.
No, and your journal, I think the phase two data shows 91% accuracy across seven different kinds of cancer. That's very promising. So, can you talk a little bit more about it in terms of, the what does it really mean from the sensitivity versus specificity standpoint? Where does it hold up?
Yeah. So I can actually share again a slightly dense table, but it helps kind of talk about a few things that we did in the paper. So, we published this paper a few months ago in the number one cancer journal, the Journal of Clinical Oncology. It's the journal of the American Society of Clinical Oncology and is widely regarded by oncologists around the world as like the journal to read when you need to inform your practice. So if you need to change which chemotherapy you are prescribing, or which diagnostic to trust, oncologists are reading JCO. So we were quite happy to have a paper published in the highest
Yeah.
peer-reviewed publication. And what we did in the study was, like I mentioned before, we had 3,000 samples. We split it in a training and a test cohort. And we then saw the ability of the dogs and a Bayesian model that we had, that basically was a statistical technique that combined multiple dog indications into a score. And we saw across different cancer types in this first table here, we had seven broad groups. The sensitivity, which is the ability to detect cancer if it's present, was 90% or above for almost all cancers. You have a few dips. Breast cancer was 87.5, head and neck was almost 90, upper GI, lower GI was above 90, but it was mostly stable. And the most important thing is for early stage cancer, stage one and two, the sensitivity remains stable as well. It was 90% and above. So what this means is when cancer is present at an early stage, and stage one is when it's a few clumps of cells in the body, it's not localized, and treatment can be very effective. It can be curative. In fact, you can just do a simple surgery that often can be even a daycare procedure to just take out those cells and make sure that they can't divide and spread in the body, right? Whereas in stage three and four, the cancer is already metastasized, spread to various lymph nodes, other parts of the body. You can't do a simple surgery, and you need these complex chemotherapy and various other regimes. And the goal of early cancer detection is to really detect cancer in stage one and two, and it can be cured. Where our dogs seem really good at doing that. They're doing it at 90%. And if you compare that to other methods that can detect multiple types of cancers, the so-called liquid biopsies, which look at circulating or cell-free DNA. So they're taking a blood sample and then sequencing it. And there are a few big companies in the US that are public companies like Grail and Exact Science. Just earlier this year, Exact Science was bought by Abbott for $25 billion. So it's a fairly big market right now. And these are established companies that have been around for the last 10, 20 years. Exact Sciences multi-cancer test that costs about $700 or 50,000 rupees, the stage one sensitivity is 25%. So the what the dogs are able to detect at stage one, their accuracy is at least three times more than this $25 billion company and a $700 test. So it really puts into perspective this ability that they have and how it compares to current methods. And if you look at other kind of gold standard screening methods as well, and it's not an apples to apples comparison because there's a lot larger studies done on things like the mammogram and the colonoscopy, and we're in the process of doing these larger studies. But just as a comparison, a mammogram is about 80% sensitive with a lot of variation depending on demographics and other things for breast cancer specifically. So if our data continues to hold, our canine breath-based test could be more accurate than the mammogram for
Wow.
all cancers, not just breast cancer. So we think it's really promising results. Now, obviously, we will be showing this in larger trials as well and in the real world. But it's not just us. As I said, 20 years of literature has shown these levels of accuracy. So we're not the first ones there. But we think we can be the first ones to solve the problem of how do you standardize and scale this process.
So do you actually have your first paying customer yet?
So we have not launched to the public yet. And in the
Commercially, you
last
haven't.
few months, we got a lot of interest. Hundreds of people reached out to us asking where they can buy a test. And we had to tell them that we're not yet publicly available. The goal is next year in Q1 to launch a test. And this would be scoped to most likely Bangalore and maybe other cities, but we might want to focus and really get the whole customer experience and the workflow of what happens. How do we provide the test, the follow up, all of these things we want to get it really right, and we're not in a hurry to launch before we have a really validated and great user experience. So the goal is in 6 months, but people can join our waitlist to take the test by just going to our website.
Interesting. So, Akash, what do you think is, because it's a highly regulated industry, obviously, and, like, while the sensitivity of mammogram might still be 80% with variations in dogs might be better, but there would be non-believers and there would be problems in going over the government regulations and other such hurdles. So, what do you think is going to be the main impediment before you do it? Your own satisfaction that yes, we are ready now to go to the public, because of course it's a very how do I put it? It's not like supply chain going wrong. It's much more sensitive topic. But so what would be more in your experience till now? What would be more difficult to get over? I mean,
Yeah.
your confidence or the regulatories.
Yeah, so it's important to clarify that our test would be what is called a pre-screening or a risk stratification tool. So we're not a diagnostic or a detection. Even though I provided the mammogram comparison, we're not really not competing with the mammogram. The mammogram is,
Established for
established
years.
screening tool that provides a very concrete follow-up and kind of is already in the establishment with 30, 40 years of
Right.
data. What we're saying is most people aren't doing a mammogram, right? Or that most cancers don't have any kind of diagnostic tool. And the challenge, both in India and even in the US and anywhere else, is that cancer, even though being a dreaded disease, you can't really test a whole population without ending up with both very challenging health economics questions. It's hard to sponsor screening for everyone, and many people are left out if it's only out of pocket. But also that just the base rate of who has cancer, but 1 in 200 people above the age of 40 in India would have any of one type of cancer at a given point in time, which means you need to test, 1,000 people to find 5 cases of cancer. And if you try and do 1,000 mammograms, both in terms of the feasibility, but also the challenge in terms of the invasiveness of the test and how uncomfortable it
Hmm.
is, it's quite a painful procedure. A lot of women in, say, rural India find it very stigmatized. and taboo. And so, if you look at India's screening statistics right now, less than 1% of Indians are screened for any type of cancer, including with validated tests that we know work. And so we really want to solve that problem by saying that we can figure out who in the population at large is most at risk based on this canine VOC score. And those people can then be triaged, right? We can focus our resources and our efforts on then finding cancer in those people when we've reduced it from a 1 in 200 to a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 20. And that suddenly changes the whole game in terms of access, in terms of cost, and in terms of overall false positives and false negatives as well. So with
Right.
this framing as a pre-screening or a risk stratification tool, we've talked to the regulators and they agree that as long as we're not claiming we're a diagnostic or a detection tool, we're actually completely above board to provide this test with the right information to the end user and with the right follow-up pathways that ensure people have a concrete way to take action on our test. And so that's what we've established. And what we really want to now validate is that it works in these trials that we have with clinical partners and oncologists around the country. So we have multiple sites in Karnataka and Maharashtra, as well as now Tamil Nadu, where we're showing that this is indeed working and it's detecting undiagnosed cancers. And we think in 6 months, we'll have compelling case studies about how this works and the trust of clinicians, where then we can launch the product.
No, amazing. So I think scientific validation is what is sort of, holding up the commercialization immediately. But once you're there, you are ready to launch because it's a
Yeah.
pre-screening.
Yeah.
No, perfect. But somebody from the audience, there are a lot of questions from the audience, by the way, and I've been also kind of reading a few out to you that shows how much interest is there in the market about it. And I think one of the questions is more to you as a founder that what has been your biggest learning as a founder operating in highly regulated sector, mostly from the standpoint of the belief of investors. Of course, you need a good amount of money for these experiments and the commercial launch. So have you faced a lot of skepticism or did you meet with enthusiastic investors who were ready to believe in this?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had to talk to a lot of VC funds. I think to date, we've probably talked to about 100 across India and the US and a few international investors as well. And, we're quite happy. A few months ago, we raised a seed round where we have some really wonderful investors on board, including Axel India, the Berkeley House Fund, um, Caffeinated Capital, which is a large US fund, and a few others in Europe and an Israeli angel syndicate as well. So we have a great team of investors who understand that we're building something that is it's really important to get right, and that trying to rush and show strong numbers out of the gate, like a AI company or I don't know, a quick commerce company, is not really the path to building a meaningful company in this space. You really need to make sure you don't lose trust in the ecosystem, which is both individuals who would take your test and clinicians who would provide interpretation and validation. You want to make sure that you are patient and get things right and launch in a staggered manner with the understanding that you have a moat, right? The moat here is clinical validation, the technology development, and external validation through papers and conferences and your network. And this is very hard to replicate. It takes time, right? You can't speed run trials. You need to go through processes to do it. So once you build a product and validate it and then go to market, you have time to actually capitalize on what you've done. And I think this awareness of how this model works and kind of the patience required to fund it is still a bit novel to a lot of Indian VC funds. So our initial pre-seed round was raised from US investors entirely who are more willing to kind of back this idea and have more patience. But now we're starting to see Indian funds also understand, and I hope more and more do in the future because, like I said, India really has a unique advantage in building clinically validated products where validation is the moat. So I hope more funds
Yeah.
support work like this that also has a positive impact, but can also generate a large return.
I think you're absolutely right. It's not just that, but also probably India is in the biggest need of something like this, which is,
Yes.
quicker and cheaper. And, people essentially don't, given the population, people don't have to stand in line to do it. Which brings me to a point that, I think it's really big and prestigious, as you mentioned, the publishing that was done in Journal of Clinical Oncology. It's very unusual for a dog-based method to be published there. And I'm sure you must have faced a lot of pushback from peers, or did you not? And if you did, what were those?
We had a great peer review process where they appreciated what we did was quite impactful and novel, and they pushed us to further refine our methods and our statistical models and our overall science. And so I think that pushback only made it better. I think we're very happy to welcome scientific criticism which is grounded in what we did and the data. There is criticism from people where they talk about like how dogs will never scale, and that that this can't be a real thing, and that the future has to be machines that cost like millions of dollars, because that's what we think is modern medicine, right? If it doesn't look fancy or cost a lot of money, then it's not modern medicine. So I think there's a human bias there about what is considered like state of the art, where the humble domestic dogs that you see on the street having technology that is better than our best efforts can maybe be a bit difficult to stomach. So we have faced like pushback on the commercial story and like the feasibility of scaling, but we've seen
Mm-hmm.
like clinicians and researchers who look at our papers, and we're also now building a scientific advisory board where it'll be formally announced soon. But we have globally renowned researchers from some of the biggest institutes in the world, from the US as well as India and the UK, actually now really believing in this work and helping us navigate the next few years of deployment and further validation. And so we're really happy with actually the reception from the clinician and scientific community in terms of recognizing that our data speaks for itself.
No, that's amazing. But Akash, did you ever face a challenge in kind of trying to rule out whether this is handler's cue or this is really dog sensing the biomarker? Did that ever happen? And if it did, then have you already figured out a way of ruling that out?
Yeah, this would be the first question that a reviewer would ask. And I believe that there was a question along these lines in our peer review process. And the response is quite, simple. The handlers are blinded to the sample identity. They don't know which samples are positive or negative until they mark an indication that is logged in a software with an audit trail.
Uh,
So the dogs don't know what samples to indicate from the handlers, because the handlers don't know, they're blinded, right? And in the real world this continues to be the case. We don't know which sample is positive or negative. When we're testing healthy people, we have to like find out and follow up. And so the next 6 months, that's exactly what we're doing in these trials. We are screening asymptomatic undiagnosed
mhm.
individuals and following up with what the dogs have said. And if the dogs are correct then as well, then there's no way to say that the dogs are somewhat reading handler cues.
No, interesting. And we were just talking about how people are kind of, I mean, the non-believers specifically are talking about how eventually the machines would take over, which costs so much, and not the but the cost factor, especially in India being a real thing, would you say that the cost of this would be say 50% or 40% lesser than what it is today for detecting cancer, or where would you benchmark the cost of this once it's out in the market? Do you have that assessment with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because many of the cancers that we're able to detect with the dogs, for example, stomach cancer, which is unfortunately quite common in India compared to a lot of other countries. When we don't really know why. Maybe it's something to do with our food supply chain or pesticide use. But it is quite common, and there's no screening modality for stomach cancer that has been established, right? So this is a cancer where we're detecting it, and it's generally there's no benchmark to compare it against. Um, but for the most part, we definitely the goal of diagnosis is to democratize early cancer detection and good health in general. And the idea is that at scale, this process is really cost effective and that we can provide it at a very affordable price point. Pricing is something that we're still working on as to how to make sure that we can cover the follow-up imaging for people, which is something that we will do while still being sustainable. So we don't have a number yet on what the test would cost. But in a few months before we launch, we will be sharing that on the people with the wait list who have joined through our website and whatnot. But the goal is to make it affordable.
Obviously. I think the success of this would hinge on how affordable and quick it is going to be, definitely compared to. Um, have you wondered, or do you worry because you are also a dog person, about the burnout in dogs while doing this? Does it really have an impact on dogs also, while they are sniffing disease? Does it, because I
Yeah.
know, I mean, dogs have very vivid emotions. So how does it impact them? This kind of work impact them?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm more worried about dogs at home and how they don't receive enough stimulation or just cognitive enrichment. They're kind of lying in couches most of the time, except for a few walks outside, and the interaction with other dogs. And dogs are pack animals, right? They're social creatures, just like humans. They like to be around other dogs, most dogs at least. And like they also like to sniff, and they don't get to sniff as often as they should. I often see people when they walk their dogs, they kind of pull them whenever they stop to sniff, and I kind of like it bothers me because like that's their one time they get to be outside and do something that they enjoy, and they kind of don't even get to do that. So we think like and our dogs are really happy to come on the sniffing platform, and for them it's basically a game of finding which odor gets them a treat, and it's using their mind, and they're being active and doing what they love to do anyways and what they evolved and were bred to do, right? So I mean dog welfare is like a huge part of like the company. I think both me and Itamar like this wouldn't make sense if some more dogs were being exploited, and we really believe that dogs should have a purpose. They should be allowed to do what they were like born to do, and that they also should be like living with other dogs or having a lot of interactions with other dogs and other humans, which they get a lot of in our facility. And we've been hosting quite a few open days at our facility where we invite members interested from the public and journalists and other founders to visit us and say hi to the dogs and spend time. And so we're very, very transparent as well about the welfare of our dogs and how they're taken care of.
That sounds interesting, and which almost brings me to the last question of this webinar. Uh, so, you've spoken extensively about how and what of the mechanisms and where you want to see, but what does the success really look like for a country like India? Because I would say that this is really something which could possibly change the way cancer is detected and treated in India today. So, what would the success look like for you?
Yeah, I'll talk about two things. One is just numbers, right? Cancer accounts for over 1 million deaths every year in India, is our estimate. We don't actually have good data on this, but from our best guesses, it's 1 million. Overall, in the world, 20 million people are diagnosed with cancer every year. And even in countries like the United States, 50% of people are diagnosed late. In India, it's one of the worst. 80% of people are diagnosed in stage 3 and 4, and this leads to millions of preventable deaths every year. And this is really unfortunate because we have the tools to actually cure cancer already, right? We don't need a Nobel Prize in cancer or some expensive immunotherapy to treat the vast majority of cancer related deaths. We just need to be detecting it earlier, often
early
3 months, 6 months, 12 months earlier. And this is a problem that we think, it's hard. Population level screening is not an easy problem. That's why it's remained unsolved. But we think diagnosis can play a really useful part about solving this problem. And I think success, zooming out from numbers, I think the first time we detect someone's cancer at an early stage and they get treatment that is essentially curative, and that they can look back and be like, wow, like this really changed my life. It could have been a lot worse. And that's something that we think in the next few months is going to happen with our current work with all the clinical sites. And I think that first person whose life would be touched by this, and it's no longer, an abstraction, it's not just a paper, it's not just numbers, it's actually a real person's life. That will be a really big moment for diagnosis and for what our work really means.
That's wonderful. I think the sheer vision of this startup is just beautiful. And if we wish you a lot of success in this, because this would mean actually changing the face of one of the most deadly diseases still in a country like India and the world eventually, of course. So thank you so much for your insight on diagnosis, Akash. It was wonderful talking to you. I would just like to
Thank you.
thank all the audience who've been a part of this, asked so many questions, and just a quick reminder that we have CII Startup Buzz, every Thursday at 5 p.m. And CII is also starting a mentorship program very soon. So feel free to call them. And Akash, once again, thank you for being part of the series.
Thank you so much.
Ravi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Jigasa, and thanks, Akash. Is Akash still
So,
there?
yeah,
Yeah,
Akash
yeah.
is there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my mobile.